What really happened in a medieval battle? Not the movie version, the real one. No slow motion sword fights, no perfect armor, no heroic music, just the truth as it was. If you've ever been curious about what it was actually like, it's time to find out. For starters, if you were an average soldier, you probably couldn't even hear the signal to attack. The guy with the horn? He was usually somewhere safe, far from the actual fighting. Smart move on his part. Medieval horn players had the highest life expectancy in the army, right behind the kings who started the wars. In the first 15 seconds of battle, nearly half the front line would trip on their own feet or their comrades. Medieval battlefields weren't neat parade grounds. They were muddy fields with hidden roots waiting to send you face first into the dirt. Nothing says fearsome warrior quite like falling on your face while screaming, "Ah, my ankle!" You didn't charge like heroes in stories. You shuffled forward in a nervous mass, your knees weak from standing in formation for hours. The man next to you breathed heavily, stinking of garlic and fear. Medieval breath mints weren't a thing, which might explain why soldiers yelled so much. It was the only way to breathe without smelling your battle buddy's lunch. Everyone shouted, but nobody could tell you exactly what they were yelling. Most men just screamed to push down their terror. Studies show that in combat, about 70% of men make involuntary noises they don't even remember afterward. If you could translate most medieval battle cries, they'd probably come out to something like, "Mom! Help! I regret everything!" Then came the first hit. Someone slammed into your shield. Your ears rang, but you couldn't tell if it was from the blow or from the man who just headbutted you. The noise was deafening. Not heroic battle music, but a wall of grunts, screams, and metal striking metal or flesh. Your arm vibrated so hard from blocking that hit, your grandchildren would be born with the shakes. 2 minutes in, your grand battle plan was reduced to one simple goal: stay upright. Falling meant death from the weight of other men stepping on you. The ground became slick with blood and vomit. Your arms ached from holding up your shield. The sun beat down, cooking you inside your padded gambeson. Medieval armor, the world's least comfortable portable sauna. The only weight loss program where you might lose 15 pounds of sweat or your head, whichever comes first. Your world shrank to the few feet around you. You just saw the terrified eyes of the man opposite you, who was just as confused as you were. In that moment, you both silently agreed that whoever told you the battle was glorious deserved a special place in hell. And all this was just the beginning. If you survived the initial clash, you'd face the next brutal reality of battle. Real medieval combat looked more like a violent rugby scrum than a fencing match. Fighters didn't square off one-on-one. They ganged up whenever possible. 5 against 1 was considered good strategy, not poor sportsmanship. Knights didn't follow a code of honor in battle. They followed the "I want to go home alive" code, which trumped everything else. The crush of bodies made proper sword technique nearly impossible. You had about 6 inches of space to move your weapon. You couldn't do those big dramatic sword arcs when pressed shoulder to shoulder with your fellow soldiers. Most sword fights involved awkwardly jabbing your blade forward like you were trying to poke someone on a crowded subway car. Swords were rarely the killing blow anyway. According to Battlefield Grave Analysis, most fatal wounds came from downward strikes to the top of the skull or neck. Exactly what would happen when someone fell and others piled on. Medieval battle strategy was less defeat your opponent fairly and more kick him when he's down, then kick him again, then maybe once more for luck. The pommel of your sword, that heavy metal knob at the end of the handle, often proved more useful than the blade. Sword experts call this half-swording or murder stroke technique, where you'd hold the blade and swing the handle like a hammer. This technique was called the murder stroke, which is probably the most honest name for any fighting move in history. Helmets saved lives but created new problems. They limited vision to a narrow slit and turned your head into a metal oven under the sun. After just 20 minutes of fighting, the temperature inside a medieval helmet could reach over 100 degrees. Many fighters died not from wounds, but from heat exhaustion. Medieval knights basically fought inside portable saunas while people tried to kill them, making them either the bravest or most foolish humans in history. If you fell during this chaos, you had about 2 seconds to get up. Not because of some rule, but because that's how long it took for boots to start trampling you or weapons to find gaps in your armor. Examination of medieval battle sites shows that many bodies were found face down in just inches of mud. Not dramatic deaths, just slow suffocation after falling. Wounds often came from unexpected angles. Your armor might stop a sword from the front, but what about the guy hitting you from behind or the side? A typical fighter received attacks from at least 3 different directions within any 1-minute period. Your head would spin trying to track all the threats, which is ironic since keeping your head from literally spinning off was the main goal. The crushing, trampling, and disorientation took more lives than straight-up combat skills. If by some miracle you survived this chaotic dog pile with all your limbs still attached, your next challenge would be dealing with whatever weapons came flying at you. The weapons of medieval battles weren't the gleaming masterpieces you see in museum displays. Most were rough tools designed for one purpose: breaking through whatever stood between you and your enemy's soft parts. Let's talk axes first. Battle axes weren't fancy. They were basically the same tool used for chopping wood, just modified to chop through shields, armor, and unfortunately, human bone. They had a major advantage. You didn't need much training to use one effectively. Swing hard, aim somewhat close to your target, and physics did the rest. The downside? Once your axe bit into something, be it a wooden shield or someone's ribcage, it often got stuck. Medieval battlefield findings show that many axe wielders died while trying to yank their weapon free. An axe getting stuck in your enemy was the medieval equivalent of your phone dying at 99% battery. Frustrating and potentially deadly. Spears were the most common weapon on medieval battlefields, with some armies using them for up to 70% of their forces. Why? They were cheap to make and required minimal training. A simple wooden shaft with a metal point could be mass-produced easily, even by smaller kingdoms with limited resources. The real benefit was reach. You could stab someone from 6 feet away while they were still trying to get close enough to hit you. The drawback was maneuverability. In tight formations, spears became more hazard than help. Battlefield records mention numerous accidental spear injuries to allies. Many medieval soldiers got poked more often by their friends' spears than by their enemies. A painful lesson in watching your back, in the most literal sense. Maces solved a problem that swords couldn't: plate armor. As metal armor improved, slashing at it became useless. The solution? Stop cutting and start crushing. A mace was essentially a heavy metal ball on a stick designed to dent armor inward, breaking bones without needing to cut through metal. Simple, effective, and terrifying. Church records from the period show that many religious knights favored maces because they technically didn't shed blood, and thus didn't violate religious restrictions. Medieval logic at its finest. I can't cut you open, but I can turn your insides into pudding. God's totally fine with that. Swords get all the glory in stories, but they were actually the least common weapon on medieval battlefields. Why? They were expensive, really expensive. A good sword could cost as much as a small house. They required special steel, skilled craftsmen, and years of training to use effectively. Only nobles and professional soldiers typically carried them, and contrary to movie magic, swords broke frequently. Analysis of battlefield swords shows that many had been repaired multiple times before their final use. Nothing ruins your heroic moment quite like your fancy sword snapping in half on the first swing, leaving you holding what amounts to a very expensive metal stick. Then, there were the improvised weapons, the desperate solutions of peasant armies and last resort fighters. Farm tools repurposed for war were remarkably common. Flails, grain threshing tools, pitchforks, and even sharpened shovels appeared regularly on medieval battlefields. Records from several major battles indicate up to 20% of common soldiers fought with modified farming equipment. These makeshift weapons often proved surprisingly effective, mainly because no one expected to be defeated by a gardening tool. Death by shovel wasn't glorious, but it was just as final as death by sword, and considerably more embarrassing to explain in the afterlife. The craftsmanship of weapons varied wildly too. While kings and nobles wielded masterfully crafted pieces, most ordinary soldiers used mass-produced arms of questionable quality. Rust, loose handles, and improperly tempered metal were common problems. Many weapons failed during use, leaving their owners scrambling for alternatives. As these crude weapons found their targets, medieval fighters quickly learned that armor didn't make them invincible, just slower when trying to escape. And the wounds these brutal tools left behind? They opened the door to a whole new level of battlefield horror. All those weapons we just talked about, they weren't designed to look cool. They were designed to tear through human bodies. And tear, they did. Armor helped, but not as much as you'd think. Chainmail could stop a slashing sword once, maybe twice. But a direct hit from an axe or mace? That mail would fold right into your flesh, turning your protection into part of the wound. Records from battlefield surgeons indicate that about 40% of armored knight casualties had shattered bones despite their armor being intact. Armor was basically medieval bubble wrap. It could handle the first drop, but anything after that was just making crunchy noises as you broke. A hit to the shoulder might take the whole arm with it. Medieval weapons didn't make clean cuts. They tore, shredded, and mangled. Most fighters who lost limbs in battle didn't die from the injury itself, but from blood loss or the infection that followed. Blood loss happened far faster than in movies where heroes fight on despite multiple wounds. The human body contains roughly 10 pints of blood, and losing just 2 can cause unconsciousness. Records suggest that many soldiers bled out in under 5 minutes after major wounds. Sometimes you didn't even know you were hit until your vision blurred and your knees gave out. Internal injuries from blunt weapons were actually worse than cuts. Nothing to stitch up, just pain and panic. A solid mace hit might not break the skin, but could rupture organs, crack ribs, or cause brain bleeding. Medieval doctors had a technical term for these hidden injuries: the "oh no, he was fine a minute ago" syndrome. Not every wound was dramatic. Teeth flew out when helmets took hits. Eyes got gouged by splinters from broken shields. Small wounds that today would need just a few stitches became life-threatening due to infection. Records from monastery hospitals show that for every soldier who died in battle, 3 more died afterward from wound infections. There were no medics waiting on the sidelines. The closest thing to battlefield medicine was other soldiers tying belts around wounded limbs to slow bleeding or cauterizing wounds with heated dagger tips. Medieval pain scales ranged from "I can still fight" to "please just kill me now," with very little in between. Field hospitals, when they existed at all, were usually just tents where the wounded were laid out on straw. Surgical tools weren't sterilized. They were maybe wiped on a cloth if you were lucky. Battlefield surgery success rates hovered around 30%, and most procedures involved amputation, not because it was always necessary, but because it was quick. The mental trauma from these wounds often proved as devastating as the physical damage. Many survivors describe feeling their minds fragment during battle, especially after seeing or experiencing horrific injuries. And as the battle wore on, your mind would begin to play tricks on you. The medieval battlefield wasn't just a test of physical strength, it was a mental nightmare that few were prepared for. As the battle raged on, something strange happened to fighters' minds, something that training couldn't prevent and that bravery couldn't overcome. Where am I? This question haunted many fighters after just 10 minutes of combat. The constant movement, the spinning to face threats from all sides, and the lack of clear sight lines meant that many soldiers quickly lost their sense of direction. Without modern communication systems, units became separated and disorganized. Studies of battle accounts reveal that approximately 60% of medieval soldiers couldn't identify which direction they were facing after the initial clash. This explains why some battles ended with both sides accidentally retreating from each other, the world's most deadly game of "you go first." Is that guy with me or against me? Recognizing friend from foe became nearly impossible once the fighting started in earnest. While armies often wore identifying colors or symbols, these quickly became covered in mud, blood, and dust. In the panic of battle, soldiers sometimes struck down their own allies by mistake. Records from the Battle of Towton in 1461 show that as many as 1 in 10 casualties may have come from friendly forces. With hundreds or thousands of fighters swirling around the battlefield, split-second decisions often had deadly consequences. Is this my blood? A terrifying moment came when you noticed you were covered in blood but couldn't tell if it was yours, your enemies, or your friends. Blood splatter from nearby kills could cover you head to toe, making it impossible to know if you were wounded without taking time to check. Time you didn't have when someone was trying to bash your head in. Many fighters described the surreal experience of being drenched in blood yet unharmed, while others didn't notice serious wounds until they felt lightheaded from blood loss. Do I swing now? Or just keep ducking? Combat decisions became almost automatic as the battle wore on. The conscious mind couldn't process information quickly enough to make thoughtful choices. Instead, fighters relied on muscle memory and instinct. Training exercises drilled into soldiers over and over again would take over. Like a dance routine your body remembers even when your mind goes blank. Those who survived battles often reported having no memory of specific actions they took. Their bodies fought while their minds went elsewhere. It's like when you drive home and suddenly realize you don't remember the last 10 minutes of the trip, except instead of missing a turn, you might have stabbed 7 people. The human brain simply wasn't designed to handle the stress of medieval combat. Fear, rage, and confusion took turns driving behavior, with little room for strategic thinking. Modern studies of how the brain processes extreme stress show that higher cognitive functions shut down under threat, leaving only the most basic survival instincts active. For medieval fighters, this meant their carefully planned battle tactics often gave way to primal responses within minutes. You'd start swinging at shapes rather than people. As exhaustion and stress mounted, vision could narrow to a tunnel. Instead of seeing whole people, fighters began to react only to movement and basic shapes. A flash of metal, a blur of color, something coming from the left. Friend or foe became irrelevant in this state. If it moved toward you, you struck at it. Records from medieval battle survivors consistently mention this odd detachment where other humans stopped looking like humans and became just threats or obstacles. After enough minutes of this sensory overload, the body would move on its own while thoughts became just white noise. Modern combat psychologists call this battle mind, a state where action precedes conscious thought. In this altered state, fighters reported feeling disconnected from their bodies, as if watching themselves fight from a distance. Time stretched or compressed, with some soldiers recalling minutes of combat that witnesses said lasted hours, or hours that passed in what felt like moments. This mental disorientation made battle even more chaotic than it already was. And when it became too much to bear, many chose the one option that actually made perfect sense. History books glorify last stands. Movies show heroic soldiers fighting to the death. The reality? Most medieval soldiers had a more sensible approach. When things got bad, they ran. Battlefield records show that about 40% of medieval armies would flee before combat reached its peak. This wasn't seen as shameful by ordinary soldiers. The shame came from nobles and knights with reputations to protect. Peasant fighters followed the "I'd like to see my family again" principle. Medieval foot soldiers had a saying, "The graveyard is full of heroes. The tavern is full of runners." Battles often ended because one side panicked first. Once a few people started running, it created a chain reaction. The Battle of Hastings featured several moments where Saxon forces broke, ran, regrouped, and returned before the final outcome. Many fighters would play dead, fake injuries, or beg for mercy when cornered. Some hid behind horses or wagons. One French soldier survived by crawling inside a dead horse for hours. Not exactly the heroic tale you'd tell your grandchildren. Running away had its own dangers. Comrades might cut you down for deserting, and in heavy armor, running any distance was exhausting. Many knights were caught simply because they ran out of breath after 100 yards. Those who did successfully escape often found that victory wasn't about glory. It was much simpler than that. When we think of victory in war movies, we see cheering soldiers, waving flags, and heroic speeches. Medieval reality, far less Instagram-worthy. If you were still standing when the dust settled, congratulations, you won. That was pretty much the only victory criteria. No elaborate ceremony, no medals, just the profound relief of not being dead yet. It was basically the world's deadliest game of musical chairs. When the fighting stopped, whoever was still standing got the prize of continued existence. No dramatic cheering erupted when battles ended. Most survivors were too exhausted, injured, or traumatized to celebrate. Battlefields after fighting were eerily quiet places, with fighters simply sitting down where they stood, too drained to speak. The typical victory cheer wasn't hurrah, but more like, thank God that's over. Does anyone have water and maybe a new pair of pants that don't have someone else's blood on them? The immediate aftermath focused on practical matters. You wiped blood off your face, hopefully not yours, and checked for wounds you hadn't noticed. You looked for your friends and collected usable weapons from the ground. Medieval post-battle checklists were simple. Arms, still attached. Legs, still work. Friends, some missing. Enemies, more missing. Overall, a good day. The field became a grim marketplace after battle. Valuable armor was stripped from the dead, regardless of which side they fought for. Even boots were taken from corpses if they looked better than yours. Medieval recycling programs were way ahead of their time. Nothing went to waste, especially if it was shiny or still had a good edge. You celebrated by drinking whatever alcohol was available to dull both physical and mental pain. One English chronicler noted after a major battle that the men drank for 3 days without pause, as if trying to drown what they had seen in cups of ale. Medieval victory parties were less, "we are the champions," and more, "please help me forget everything through the magic of fermentation." Medical tents became crowded with the wounded. Field hospitals had mortality rates between 25 and 50%. Medieval hospital waiting rooms had just 2 categories: might live and probably won't. Your category largely depended on whether the surgeon had gotten enough sleep the night before. The physical aftermath lingered for days. Bruises appeared where you didn't remember being hit. Sleep came with difficulty, interrupted by sudden movements to block attacks that weren't there. Nothing says successful warrior quite like punching the air in your sleep and accidentally giving your spouse a black eye while fighting an enemy who died 3 years ago. And somewhere in the mud, a broken helmet sat crooked on a stick. Medieval battlefields were rarely cleaned. They simply grew over, with occasional bits of metal working their way to the surface centuries later. What movies call victory was really just the beginning of a different kind of struggle. One fought not against enemies, but against pain, loss, and the knowledge of what humans could do to each other when ordered to fight. Ever wondered how people kept food fresh before electricity? Back in medieval times, they couldn't just pop leftovers in the fridge or order takeout when the pantry was empty. They had to get creative, really creative. Some of their methods were brilliant, others were bizarre, and a few were downright hilarious. And nowhere was this creativity more evident than in the medieval kitchens. These wild and busy places were nothing like our sparkly clean ones today. Instead of fridges, they had dangling meats, herbs hanging everywhere, and more salt than a pretzel factory. The kitchen was the heart of any medieval home, always smoky, warm, and filled with interesting smells. These kitchens stored the basics: preserved meats, dried veggies, and tons of bread. The funny thing is, they didn't have any of our modern must-haves. Imagine trying to explain ketchup to a medieval cook. They had to start storing food as soon as spring arrived because winter was no joke, and trust me, they couldn't exactly order pizza when times got tough. Speaking of storing food, it all began with salt. You wouldn't believe this, but salt was so precious that Roman soldiers got paid in it. That's where we get the word salary from. Pretty crazy, right? And in medieval times, some smart traders in Venice built entire fortunes just by controlling the salt trade. These guys were like the medieval version of tech billionaires, except instead of selling smartphones, they were selling tiny white crystals. Here's how salting worked. They'd rub meat or fish with tons of salt, sometimes using up to 20% of the food's weight in salt alone. The meat would then shrivel up like a raisin in the sun, but that was exactly what they wanted. The salt basically turned the food into a medieval version of beef jerky. One recipe from a 13th century kitchen said to salt the meat until it looks like it's covered in snow, which honestly sounds like my cooking when I accidentally knock over the salt shaker. The coolest part? They found ways to salt practically everything. Fish got packed in barrels with layers of salt, kind of like a really unappetizing lasagna. Pork became ham and bacon. Even vegetables got in on the action. They made sauerkraut by salting cabbage until it fermented. Medieval doctors actually thought all this salt was good for you. Bet they'd have a heart attack if they saw our modern health guidelines. But there was a huge problem with relying on salt. It was expensive. A pound of salt could cost a week's wages for a regular worker. My favorite story is about a medieval French village that traded an entire flock of sheep just for enough salt to last the winter. But when salt was hard to come by, medieval folks turned their kitchens into smokehouses. And I mean that literally. The entire room would be filled with so much smoke that if a medieval cook walked into a modern BBQ joint, they'd probably feel right at home. Except medieval kitchens didn't have those fancy exhaust fans we use today, which meant everyone probably smelled like smoked bacon 24/7. Not that anyone was complaining. smelling like bacon beets, smelling like, well, whatever else people smelled like in medieval times. The smoking process was actually pretty genius. They'd hang meat or fish high up in special chimneys or in the kitchen rafters where the smoke from cooking fires would slowly work its magic. The best woods for smoking were oak, apple, and cherry, each adding its own special flavor. One medieval German cookbook even listed specific wood types for different meats: oak for beef, apple for pork, and cherry for poultry. Talk about being picky with your smoke. Fun fact, archaeologists found a perfectly preserved smokehouse from 1375 in London. And guess what? The ceiling beams still smelled like smoke even after 600 years. These guys really knew what they were doing. The smoke didn't just make food taste good, it created a protective layer that kept bugs and bacteria away. It's like they invented an all-natural food force field. But smoking wasn't just for meat. They smoked cheese too, which helped it last way longer. Some of today's most famous cheeses, like smoked Gouda, started as medieval preservation techniques. They even smoked grains to keep them from getting moldy, though I bet that made for some interesting tasting bread. My favorite discovery was that they sometimes smoked eggs. Imagine trying to explain that to your chickens. Sorry, girls, but your eggs are going to smell like a campfire. The really fancy medieval homes had separate smokehouses, complete with different levels for different foods. The top level was for lighter smoking, like fish, the middle for medium smoking, like pork, and the bottom near the fire was for heavy smoking, like beef. It was basically a medieval version of a multi-level parking garage, except instead of cars, it was filled with dangling food. But what happened when smoking wasn't enough? Well, that's when medieval folks turned to nature's freezer. And trust me, they got pretty creative with snow and ice, because deep underground cellars were like the medieval version of a Frigidaire. Except instead of an ice maker, you had servants running around in winter collecting snow and ice like it was some kind of frozen treasure hunt. The really wealthy nobles had special buildings called ice houses. These weren't your average garden sheds. They were more like underground ice bunkers. The biggest one ever found was at Hampton Court Palace. And get this, it could hold 75 tons of ice. That's enough to make slushies for an entire medieval army. The ice houses were built kind of like upside-down ice cream cones, dug deep into the ground with super thick walls. Some rich folks even hired ice masters whose only job was to keep the ice from melting. Talk about a cool job title. Here's a wild fact. Medieval ice houses worked so well that some of them kept ice frozen for up to 2 years. The secret? They packed sawdust between layers of ice, which worked like a medieval version of insulation, and you thought your cooler at the beach was impressive, but what if you weren't rich enough to have your own personal ice fortress? Well, that's where caves and stone cellars came in handy. Natural caves stayed at a pretty steady 50 to 55 degrees Fahrenheit all year round, perfect for keeping food freshish. Medieval people would store their cheese, eggs, and vegetables in these cool spots. Some monasteries even built their own artificial caves just for storing wine and beer. Those monks knew their priorities. The funniest part about medieval cold storage was how they'd pack perishable food in snow during winter parties. Imagine being a medieval party planner. Okay, we need 3 barrels of wine, 2 roasted pigs, and enough snow to keep the fish from going bad. And maybe extra snow for snowball fights. They'd actually serve frozen desserts at fancy feasts, basically medieval snow cones flavored with honey or fruit juices. And yes, sometimes they'd write warnings like, "Don't eat the yellow snow," even back then. Some jokes never get old. But winter doesn't last forever unless you're living in medieval Iceland, and eventually all that lovely ice would melt away. That's when medieval folks had to turn to their backup plan, drying everything in sight. And when I say everything, I mean everything. Medieval people turned food drying into an art form. They dried absolutely everything that didn't run away first. Meat became jerky, grapes turned into raisins, and plums transformed into prunes. They'd string up fruits and vegetables on long ropes, hanging them from their rafters like medieval Christmas decorations. The whole house probably looked like some kind of weird food festival that never ended. Did you know they even had special drying towers? These tall buildings had open sides with wooden slats to let air flow through while keeping birds out. One famous tower in France could dry over 2,000 pounds of fruit at once. That's more fruit than a modern grocery store keeps in stock. They'd load these towers up with pears, apples, figs, you name it. The locals called them fruit castles, which honestly sounds like a way better name than food dehydrator. Some of these towers still exist today, and archaeologists found dried fruit bits stuck in the corners that are over 500 years old. Talk about ancient snacks. The really clever part was how they figured out different drying techniques for different foods. Herbs got bundled up and hung upside down, making medieval kitchens look like they were decorated by someone who really loved plants. Meat was cut into super thin strips, the thinner the better, because nobody wanted to bite into a piece of half-dried beef. That's just asking for a medieval stomachache. They even had special drying rooms with little windows that could be opened or closed depending on the weather, like a medieval version of climate control. Medieval cookbooks actually had specific instructions about drying food. One from the 1300s says, "Cut your meat as thin as a monk's patience during Lent." Another one warned, "If your dried beef bounces when dropped, you've done it right. If it shatters, you've created a weapon." They dry fish too, beating it flat first until it was practically paper thin. These dried fish were so hard, you could probably use them as roof tiles in an emergency. In fact, there's a story about Norwegian sailors using dried fish as plates. Talk about reducing your dishes. The best part about dried food, it was incredibly lightweight. A whole cow dried down to the size of a modern backpack. Armies loved this. They could carry weeks' worth of food without needing a wagon train. Medieval armies actually had special officers in charge of dried food supplies. These guys had the exciting title of Keeper of the Dry Stores, which probably wasn't the most impressive title at medieval parties. Although I bet soldiers got pretty tired of gnawing on beef jerky day after day. "What's for dinner tonight, Captain?" "Dried beef." "And tomorrow? Still dried beef? Next week?" Take a wild guess. But sometimes just drying food wasn't enough, especially in places where the weather was too humid or rainy. That's when medieval folks turned to their secret weapon, vinegar. Because the medieval world was absolutely crazy about vinegar and fermentation. You couldn't walk into a medieval kitchen without bumping into barrels of fermenting vegetables. They pickled everything, and I mean everything. Cabbage turned into sauerkraut, cucumbers became pickles, and they even fermented fish. One recipe from a medieval German cookbook just says, "Put it in vinegar until it stops smelling like fish and starts smelling like regret." Some historians think medieval Europeans pickled more food per person than any other civilization in history. The science behind fermentation is pretty cool. You know how your mom tells you not to let food go bad? Well, medieval people actually let food go bad in exactly the right way. They discovered that certain types of good bacteria could fight off the bad bacteria that makes you sick. A single barrel of sauerkraut could feed a family through winter and give them enough vitamin C to avoid scurvy. That's right, medieval people were fighting off pirate diseases before pirates were even cool. Tests on surviving medieval recipes show their fermented foods had more beneficial bacteria than most modern probiotic supplements. Some monasteries had entire rooms dedicated to fermentation. The monks kept detailed records of their pickling experiments, which is how we know that one monastery in France pickled over 15,000 eggs in a single year. Can you imagine being the poor monk in charge of that job? "Brother John, what's your holy duty?" "Oh, I pickle eggs. Thousands of them. My hands perpetually smell like vinegar, and I haven't tasted anything else in 3 years." The monks even wrote poems about pickling. There's one that goes on for 50 verses about the proper way to ferment turnips. But the real pickling champions were the Vikings. These guys took fermentation to a whole new level. They made something called lutefisk, fermented fish soaked in lye until it became jelly-like. Yes, you read that right. They deliberately turned perfectly good fish into fish jelly. Even better, they considered it a delicacy. There's an old Norse saying that translates to, "A brave man fears many things, but only a fool fears not the lutefisk." Archaeological digs have found Viking fermentation barrels that still contain traces of fish after 1,000 years, though thankfully nobody's tried to taste them. The best part about fermented foods? They actually got better with age, unlike that sandwich you forgot in your backpack. Some medieval noble families had barrels of pickled vegetables that they passed down through generations like family heirlooms. "Here, son, I pass to you this sacred barrel of pickled turnips. It was your great-grandfather's dying wish that you continue adding vinegar to it." One barrel of pickled cabbage found in an English castle had been continuously maintained for over 40 years. They also used fermentation to make medicine. Got a headache? Try some fermented cabbage juice? Upset stomach? Here's some pickled radish. Medieval doctors prescribed fermented foods for everything from the common cold to broken bones. I guess when all you have is a barrel of pickles, everything looks like a pickling problem. One medieval hospital went through over 50 gallons of fermented vegetable juice every month, though whether this helped the patients or just gave them something else to complain about is still debated. But if you wanted to preserve something really special, something that needed to last for years, there was an even sweeter option: honey. And the coolest thing about it? It never goes bad. Never. Scientists once found 3,000-year-old honey in Egyptian tombs that was still perfectly good to eat, though maybe don't go raiding ancient tombs for a midnight snack. Medieval people knew about honey's superpower and used it for pretty much everything. They'd pour it over fruits, meats, and even whole birds to preserve them. One recipe from a medieval cookbook suggests preserving a whole peacock in honey, because apparently regular chicken wasn't fancy enough. Medieval beekeepers were like rock stars. They had special legal protections and could even get away with trespassing if they were chasing after their bees. Records from one English manor show they paid their beekeeper more than their cook, which tells you exactly how much they valued their honey supply. A good beekeeper could manage up to 100 hives, producing enough honey to preserve food for an entire village. The really wild part is how they used honey in medicine. Got a nasty cut? Slap some honey on it. Can't sleep? Honey and warm milk. Bad case of bubonic plague? Well, honey probably wouldn't help with that, but they tried it anyway. Medieval doctors wrote entire books about honey-based medicines. One famous doctor prescribed honey water for everything from toothaches to broken hearts, though I suspect the broken heart patients would have preferred chocolate. Here's a crazy fact: some medieval castles had special honey rooms. These were warm, dry spaces where they stored their honey-preserved foods. The walls would get all sticky from honey drips, and apparently bugs would get stuck to them like medieval flypaper. One castle's records complain about having to scrape the walls clean every spring because the honey rooms have caught more flies than food. Rich people would preserve exotic fruits in honey to show off their wealth. Oh, you've never had honey-preserved lemons from Sicily? How common. They'd serve these fancy preserved fruits at feasts, probably making everyone else feel bad about their regular old pickled turnips. Some nobles even had special honey-preserved fruit collections, kind of like medieval Pokemon cards. Gotta preserve them all. The funniest part was how they tested if honey was pure enough for preservation. They'd drop a chicken feather in it. If the feather sank too quickly, the honey was too watery. One medieval text warns, if your honey cannot hold a feather, it cannot hold your dinner. They also believed that the best preserving honey came from bees that had visited holy sites, because obviously religious bees make better honey. But what if you wanted to preserve something and make it more fun at the same time? Well, that's where alcohol came in, because nothing says food preservation like drowning your fruits in wine. Medieval people discovered that alcohol wasn't just for getting tipsy at feasts, it was actually an amazing food preservative. Fruits, vegetables, and even eggs could last for months when soaked in wine or beer. One medieval French castle went through over 100,000 liters of wine a year, and only half of it was for drinking. The rest, they used it to preserve everything from cherries to whole geese. You've got to love their logic here. This wine keeps us feeling good. Maybe it'll keep our food feeling good too. And you know what? They were absolutely right. The alcohol killed off bacteria and kept food from spoiling. Some medieval monasteries had entire cellars dedicated to alcohol-preserved foods. The monks would spend their days preserving fruits in wine and then writing poetry about it. Talk about living your best medieval life. The most popular preserved treats were drunken fruits. Basically, medieval cocktail garnishes. They'd soak plums, cherries, and peaches in spiced wine until they turned into boozy little flavor bombs. One recipe warns, these fruits will make you twice as merry as regular fruits. They even preserved meat in alcohol, though that was probably more about desperation than taste. Nothing says we're running out of options, quite like a chicken floating in a barrel of beer. Here's a weird one. They preserved eggs in alcohol. They'd crack them into barrels of wine or beer where they'd sort of pickle. Medieval taverns actually served these boozy eggs as bar snacks, because apparently regular pickled eggs weren't interesting enough. There's a story about a merchant who tried to eat 3 wine-preserved eggs on a bet and ended up singing tavern songs in Latin, and he didn't even know Latin. The really fancy folks got creative with their alcohol preservation. They'd layer fruits with different kinds of wine to create pretty patterns in the storage jars. One noble family had a special barrel where they preserved fruit in layers of red and white wine, making it look like a striped medieval flag. Real medieval Instagram material right there. Records from a royal kitchen show they spent more on preservation wine than they did on meat. Though knowing medieval royalty, they probably drank half the preservation supply anyway. But the absolute best part? They figured out that stronger alcohol worked better for preservation. This led to some, let's say, enthusiastic research into distillation. No, my lord, I'm not making extra strong wine for fun. It's for preserving these, very important royal pairs. Yes, that's it. Royal pairs. And there you have it. Medieval preservation done 7 different ways. From simple salt to fancy wine, they figured out how to keep their food edible through thick and thin. Next time you open your fridge, thank your medieval ancestors for figuring out all these preservation tricks. Though maybe skip the wine-soaked eggs, medieval peasants are often seen as poor and struggling all the time. But is that the full story? Before you decide, it helps to take a closer look at what their lives were really like, beyond the usual stories everyone knows. When we think of medieval peasants, we often picture starving people eating dirt and bugs to survive. But the truth is a bit different. Their meals weren't fancy 5-course dinners, but they weren't constantly on the edge of starvation either. The daily diet of a medieval peasant centered around bread, lots and lots of bread. Unlike our fluffy white supermarket loaves, peasant bread was dark, dense, and made from whatever grains grew locally. Rye and barley were common, with wheat reserved for the wealthy. A typical peasant might eat 1 to 2 pounds of bread every single day. That's like eating an entire modern loaf by yourself. Porridge was another staple, cheap, filling, and easy to make. Just throw some oats or barley into a pot with water, and you've got yourself a meal. Beans, peas, onions, garlic, and turnips rounded out the daily fare. These vegetables were usually grown in small garden plots right next to the peasant's home. Would you like some meat with your bread? Sorry, we're fresh out. How about some more bread instead? This joke would have made perfect sense to a medieval peasant. Meat was special, not an everyday thing. Most peasants might enjoy meat only during feast days or special occasions, perhaps 40 to 50 days a year if they were lucky. Pork was the most common, as pigs were relatively easy to raise on scraps and forage in nearby woods. Fresh fish was available to those who lived near rivers or the coast. But for inland peasants, salted herring became a crucial protein source, especially during Lent when church rules forbade meat. One interesting food fact: eggs were more accessible than meat, providing crucial protein when meat wasn't available. Now, about drinks, water wasn't always trusted, and for good reason. It could make you sick. Instead, ale was the everyday drink for everyone, including children. Records from medieval England show that an adult male laborer could drink up to a gallon of ale daily. Before you picture drunk peasants stumbling around fields, know that medieval ale was weaker than modern beer. Though still, those farming fields with a slight buzz might explain some of the crooked rows. Preparing medieval meals was no quick drive-through experience. A peasant woman, because cooking was almost always women's work, might spend hours each day just making bread. First grinding grain by hand, mixing dough, letting it rise, then baking in a communal oven or under hot ashes at home. Compare that to our 2-minute microwave meals. During good harvest years, this diet provided enough calories to sustain hard physical labor. But one bad harvest could change everything. Crop failures due to weather or war meant serious hunger. Food security was always uncertain. Medieval accounts describe desperate measures during famines, grinding tree bark into flour or boiling leather to make soup. Seasons dramatically affected what was available. Late winter and early spring, known as the Hungry Gap, were especially tough when stored food was running low and new crops weren't ready. Fall, right after harvest, brought relative abundance. One medieval festival tradition involved baking extraordinarily large loaves of bread after the grain harvest, some reportedly weighing over 40 pounds. The foods that filled peasant bellies sustained them through harsh times and grueling work. While their bread-heavy meals might seem boring to our modern tastes, this simple diet was the foundation that kept medieval life going. But food was only one part of daily survival. Let's talk about medieval peasant homes. They weren't exactly featured in Better Homes and Gardens. A typical peasant house was tiny by today's standards, usually just 1 or 2 rooms where an entire family lived together. These weren't spacious open-concept layouts with walk-in closets and ensuite bathrooms. The basic structure started with a wooden frame made from whatever trees grew nearby. Pine, oak, elm, anything that could be cut down and shaped would do. Next came the walls, which were mostly wattle and daub, a fancy term for sticks woven together like a basket, then covered with mud mixed with straw, dung, and clay. This mixture dried hard and provided decent insulation against cold winds. Floors, nothing but hard-packed earth. Wall-to-wall carpeting meant scattered rushes or straw that caught all manner of dirt, crumbs, and little presents from the family dog. These floor coverings were changed only a few times a year, creating what must have been quite the aromatic experience. For the roof, bundles of straw, reeds, or whatever waterproof plant material was available were layered and tied together. A well-made thatch roof could last 20 years if maintained properly, but it also made a cozy home for mice, bugs, and birds. The peak of the roof often had a hole to let smoke escape from the fire below. Speaking of fire, heating and cooking happened around an open hearth right in the middle of the main room. No chimneys existed in most peasant homes until the late Middle Ages. Smoke would fill the upper part of the house before finding its way out through the roof hole or just seeping through the thatch. Windows were rare luxuries. Most homes had just small openings that might be covered with oiled paper, cloth, or wooden shutters during bad weather. Glass windows, those were for churches and rich folks. Medieval peasants could truthfully say they didn't need fancy curtains because they barely had walls. In winter, things got even more crowded when animals were brought inside. Cows, goats, chickens, and pigs might share the space with humans. This wasn't because medieval peasants were especially fond of their livestock. It was simply practical. Animals generated body heat, keeping the house warmer, and it also prevented valuable animals from freezing to death or being stolen. Privacy didn't exist in these homes. Entire families slept in one room, often sharing a single large bed filled with straw. Children might sleep at the foot of their parents' bed or on the floor nearby. Bedbugs, fleas, and lice were unwelcome but ever-present roommates. A fascinating fact. Studies of preserved medieval homes show that the average peasant dwelling in England was about 400 square feet. That's smaller than many modern studio apartments. A family of 5 to 8 people might live in this space together. Storage space was creative and limited. Ropes stretched across rafters held drying herbs and meat. Baskets hung from walls contained essential tools. Every inch of space needed a purpose, and nothing was wasted. These humble dwellings kept peasants mostly sheltered from weather and wild animals, but they were constantly in need of repair. After shelter and food came another daily concern. Money talks, even in medieval times. But how much did a hard day's work actually pay for a peasant? Let's break down the medieval economy in terms we can all understand. Most peasants worked the land. From sunrise to sunset, they plowed fields, planted crops, harvested grain, and tended to animals. The work was backbreaking and constant, with different tasks depending on the season. Spring meant plowing and planting. Summer brought weeding and maintenance. Fall was harvest time. Winter involved repairs, spinning wool, and other indoor tasks. For those who weren't tied to farming, other job options existed. Skilled trades like blacksmithing, carpentry, tanning, and weaving offered alternatives. Women often worked as brewers, bakers, or spinners alongside their household duties. Children as young as 7 started working, usually helping their parents or serving as apprentices. Now, for the big question, what did they earn? A typical unskilled laborer in England around the 1300s might make 1 or 2 pennies per day. Skilled workers earned more. Carpenters and blacksmiths could command 3 to 4 pennies daily. For context, a single penny then had much more purchasing power than our modern coins. What could a medieval penny buy? A decent loaf of bread cost about half a penny. A chicken would set you back 2 pennies. A gallon of that everyday ale went for roughly 1 penny. Cloth for a simple shirt might cost 3 or 4 pennies. Medieval budget advisors would have had a simple tip sheet. Monday, buy bread. Tuesday through Sunday, good luck. Most peasants lived close to the edge financially. One bad harvest or unexpected expense could push a family into debt or worse. Paying for things worked differently back then. Actual coins were used less frequently than you might expect. Instead, many workers received payment in goods like food, housing, or the right to use land. A blacksmith might fix a farmer's plow in exchange for grain. A laborer might work extra days for the lord of the manor to pay rent on his small cottage. The concept of wages as we know them was still developing. Many peasants were serfs, legally bound to the land they worked. They didn't receive salaries, but instead kept a portion of what they produced after giving the required amount to their lord. This system, called manorialism, meant your economic situation was largely determined by birth. Records from medieval England give us fascinating details about pay rates. After the Black Death killed nearly half the population in the mid-1300s, surviving laborers suddenly found themselves in high demand. Wages increased dramatically, in some cases doubling or tripling. This labor shortage alarmed authorities so much that England's King Edward III issued the Statute of Laborers in 1351, attempting to freeze wages at pre-plague levels. Like many minimum wage laws through history, workers found creative ways around these restrictions faster than you can say under-the-table payment. Court records show frequent fines for workers who demanded higher pay than legally allowed. One mason in Oxford was caught accepting excessive wages of 5 pennies daily plus meals, a medieval version of salary plus benefits. While their homes offered basic shelter and their diets provided just enough nutrition, medieval peasants' wages gave them little opportunity to improve their situation. Yet surviving on these meager earnings was just one of many challenges they faced in their daily lives. There was more to medieval peasant existence than just working all day and counting pennies at night. Hard as it may be to believe, medieval peasants weren't working every single hour of their lives. They actually had days off, and more of them than you might expect. No, they weren't spending their free time scrolling through Ye Old Book or playing angry peasants on their stone tablets. The medieval work calendar revolved around religion. Sundays were mandatory rest days according to church law. Working on the Lord's Day could get you in serious trouble with both heavenly and earthly authorities. This weekly break gave peasants a day to attend church, rest their bodies, and spend time with family. But Sundays were just the beginning. The medieval calendar was packed with religious holidays and saints' days, somewhere between 40 and 50 days per year when work was forbidden. Add these to Sundays, and medieval peasants enjoyed roughly 1 day off for every 3 they worked. Major religious festivals like Christmas and Easter stretched across multiple days. For example, the Christmas celebration lasted 12 days, from December 25th to January 6th. During these periods, much regular work stopped completely. What did peasants do with this free time? For starters, they drank. A lot. Village alehouses served as the medieval equivalent of community centers where people gathered to gossip, sing, play games, and yes, consume impressive amounts of ale. Medieval drinking songs were probably the original karaoke, just as loud and just as off-key, but with more verses about farming. Physical games were incredibly popular. Medieval football looked nothing like modern soccer. It was a chaotic free-for-all where entire villages competed to move a ball from one landmark to another. Think of it as soccer meets rugby meets a tavern brawl, minus the yellow cards, but with extra bruises. With no referee and very few rules, these matches often ended with broken bones and bloody noses. Authorities repeatedly tried to ban these games because they were too violent and distracted people from archery practice, which was actually useful for national defense. Wrestling matches drew crowds of spectators. Strong young men would grapple and throw each other to prove their strength and win small prizes or just bragging rights. Records show that accidental deaths during these wrestling matches weren't uncommon. For less violent entertainment, peasants enjoyed music and dancing. Professional traveling musicians were rare treats, but many villages had talented locals who played pipes, drums, or stringed instruments. Simple circle dances would break out at festivals, with everyone from children to grandparents joining in. Storytelling filled winter evenings. With no television or internet, oral traditions thrived. Tales of heroes, saints, monsters, and magic passed down through generations. The medieval version of Netflix was just Grandpa by the fire, telling the same dragon story for the 100th time. and nobody could skip to the next episode. These weren't just entertainment. They preserved cultural values and practical knowledge. A fascinating fact: church records show complaints about peasants skipping Mass to attend plays or games, suggesting that even with limited options, medieval people still found ways to avoid boring obligations in favor of fun. Seasonal activities dotted the calendar. Spring brought maypole dances, where villagers wrapped a tall pole with ribbons while dancing in circles. Midsummer celebrations featured bonfires that people would jump over for good luck. Harvest festivals included competitions for the best crops and feasts where everyone contributed food. While modern historians once believed medieval peasants lived lives of unrelenting misery, evidence from court records, church complaints, and archaeological findings tell a different story. These people worked incredibly hard, but they also played hard during their time off. These moments of rest and celebration helped peasants cope with the harsh realities of medieval life. The ability to occasionally step away from work, share joy with neighbors, and forget their troubles for a moment was crucial. Of course, when the festivities ended, they returned to a world filled with other daily challenges that required different kinds of strength to overcome. When we picture medieval peasants, we often imagine filthy people who never bathed. Movies show them with blackened teeth and covered in muck. But is that really accurate? The answer might surprise you. First off, medieval people did bathe. Public bathhouses were common in towns until the late Middle Ages. People understood that cleaning themselves felt good and helped prevent certain illnesses. Many households had wooden tubs they'd fill with heated water for washing. During summer, streams and rivers served as natural bathing spots. "Sir, your bath is ready. We've warmed the water to a perfect temperature of whatever temperature water happens." To be when you carry it from bath time wasn't as convenient as turning on a faucet, but it existed. The idea that medieval folks avoided water completely is simply wrong. What about dental hygiene? Toothbrushes as we know them didn't exist, but people still cleaned their teeth. They'd rub them with rough cloth, sometimes using mixtures of herbs, salt, or even crushed charcoal as an early form of toothpaste. Mouthwashes made from herbs like sage and mint helped freshen breath. These methods weren't perfect, but they weren't nothing either. That said, health problems were abundant. Without modern medicine, even minor injuries could become deadly if infected. A simple cut while working in the fields might lead to blood poisoning. Broken bones, if not set properly, could cause lifelong disability. Disease was the greatest threat. The Black Death famously killed between 30 to 60% of Europe's population in the mid-1300s. But everyday illnesses took even more lives over time. Influenza, typhoid, dysentery, and tuberculosis spread quickly in crowded living conditions. Childbirth was especially dangerous. Many women died during delivery or from infections afterward. This partly explains why medieval women often had many pregnancies. Sadly, not all children survived to adulthood. Records from English villages show that for every 5 children born, only 2 or 3 might reach age 10. Medical treatment was a mix of practical knowledge and what we'd call superstition today. Got a headache? Your local healer might suggest a mix of willow bark tea, which contains natural aspirin, and wearing a special stone around your neck, which contains zero medicine whatsoever. Surprisingly, some medieval surgeons were quite skilled. They could set bones, remove bladder stones, and even perform basic eye surgery for cataracts. Most operations happened without anesthesia, though alcohol or opium sometimes dulled the pain. One common misconception involves medieval life expectancy. We often hear that people only live to be 30 or 40 years old. This is technically true, but misleading. The average was dragged down by extremely high infant and child mortality. If you survived childhood, you had a decent chance of seeing 50 or 60 years. Not so different from more recent history before modern medicine. Evidence from cemetery excavations shows many medieval peasants suffered from arthritis, likely from years of hard physical labor. Dental problems were common too, though not primarily from lack of cleaning. Coarse bread wore down teeth, and without dental care, any damage was permanent. The harsh realities of disease, injury, and limited medical knowledge meant medieval peasants faced health challenges at every turn. Yet even with these struggles, they still had to deal with another constant pressure in their lives. You think your taxes are bad? Let's talk about medieval money troubles. The medieval tax system wasn't just complicated, it was designed to extract as much as possible from those who had the least to give. Peasants lived under a constant rain of financial demands. First came rent to their lords. Most peasants didn't own their land outright. Instead, they held it from a noble lord and paid for that privilege, usually with a combination of money, crops, and labor. This wasn't a simple monthly payment. The amount could change based on harvests, the lord's needs, or simply because the lord said so. Next came the church tithe, a mandatory 10% of everything a peasant produced. That's right, 1/10 of all crops, animals, and products went straight to the church. And this wasn't optional or tax deductible. Church representatives would actually come to inspect your harvest to make sure you weren't holding back. Good news, the church only wants 10% of your crops. The bad news, your lord wants the other 90. This wasn't far from the truth for many medieval peasants. Random fees popped up constantly throughout a peasant's life. Need to use the lord's mill to grind your grain? That'll cost you. Want to marry? There's a fee for that. Did someone in your family die? Time to pay the Harriet, a death tax where the lord took your best animal or tool. The most unusual fees came from strange medieval customs. For example, in some places, peasants had to pay a merchet when their daughters married, essentially compensating the lord for the loss of a worker. In other areas, lords had the right of first dibs on anything a peasant wanted to sell. What happens if you can't pay? The consequences were harsh. You might lose your land rights, be forced into extra labor, or even face imprisonment. Debt wasn't seen as an unfortunate circumstance, but as a moral failing and crime. Medieval records tell tales of creative payment methods when coins were scarce. One Yorkshire peasant paid his taxes with a bundle of arrows he had crafted. A family in Normandy settled their debt with their lord by providing him with a large cheese every autumn for 7 years. The total tax burden could be crushing. Studies of medieval English manners suggest peasants might surrender 20 to 30% of everything they produced through various payments. This doesn't sound drastically different from modern tax rates until you remember that medieval peasants were already living at subsistence level. Every egg taken in tax was an egg not feeding their children. Medieval tax collectors were the original inspiration for horror stories. Look out, here comes the Lord Steward, was scarier than any ghost tale. Seasonal payments created another layer of stress. Most fees came due after harvest when peasants had crops to sell or trade. A poor harvest meant impossible choices between paying taxes or feeding your family. Court records reveal that peasants developed sophisticated strategies for managing these financial pressures. Some formed informal lending networks within villages. Others specialized in craft production they could sell for coins. Many simply negotiated payment plans or begged for mercy from their lords. The financial pressure cooker of medieval peasant life shaped every decision, from what crops to plant to how many children to have. Yet through all these hardships, medieval peasants found ways to survive and occasionally thrive, creating communities and traditions that would last for centuries, leaving a legacy that still influences our world today. Life as a medieval archer was brutal, physically, mentally, and in every way that mattered. It wasn't just about shooting arrows. It was about surviving a job that demanded everything and gave back almost nothing. The real question isn't whether it was tough, it's whether you could do it. Growing up as a medieval archer wasn't a choice. It was often your destiny from the moment you could stand. Kings across England didn't politely suggest archery practice, they mandated it by law. When medieval monarchs issued archery laws, they weren't making friendly recommendations. They were ordering every able-bodied male between 7 and 60 to practice with the longbow every Sunday after church. Skip practice? Enjoy your fine or time in the stocks. Imagine being 10 years old, handed a bow nearly as tall as you, and told to pull it back. Not once or twice, but hundreds of times until your small hands blistered and bled. The adults around you didn't care about your tears or complaints. Their logic was brutal but simple. If you couldn't pull the bow, you were useless in battle. Again would be the constant command as your shoulders burned and fingers split open. Your first bow might be smaller, but by 12 or 13, you'd be expected to handle the real thing. And that real thing required the strength that would impress even the burliest modern athlete. Training wasn't just about hitting targets, it It was about building the freakish upper body strength needed to repeatedly draw a bow, requiring over 100 pounds of force. While other children played, young archers spent hours pulling weights, lifting stones, and practicing the same motion thousands of times until their bodies physically changed. The evidence of this brutal childhood training still exists today in skeletal remains showing bizarre bone deformities, oversized left arms, twisted spines, and bone spurs on fingers from years of constant strain. Examinations of medieval graves found archer remains with left arm bones 50% thicker than their right. Their bodies literally warped around their profession. By 16, successful trainees could fire up to 12 arrows per minute with accuracy at 200 yards. Their fingers had permanent grooves worn into them and calluses so thick a needle couldn't pierce them if they tried, which was probably for the best since medieval medicine consisted mainly of rub some dirt on it and get back to practice. The worst part? This childhood of pain was just the beginning. After years of brutal training, you'd think an archer would love their weapon. The reality was far more complicated. The English longbow was both a marvel of medieval warfare and a relentless source of physical torment. First, its sheer size. Standing between 5 feet 10 inches and 6 feet 6 inches, it often matched or exceeded the height of its wielder. Crafted from yew, it weighed only 3 to 5 pounds, but after miles of marching, that was weight enough. The real brutality lay in its draw force. Recovered bows reveal draw weights between 90 and 180 pounds, 2 to 3 times the force of modern hunting bows. Imagine lifting a medium-sized dog with 3 fingers, then repeating it 400 times in an afternoon. There was no trick to making it easier, just raw muscle power. The toll was devastating. Archer skeletons show enlarged bones, compressed spines, and severe arthritis. Some develop such massive bone spurs on their drawing hands that they must have lived in constant pain. Yet they kept shooting. Maintenance was another battle. Hemp or flax bowstrings required regular waxing and had to be kept dry. Spare strings were carried wrapped around the head beneath helmets, medieval multitasking at its finest. The bow itself, if stored improperly, would warp and become useless. Even well-maintained bows had short lifespans, sometimes breaking after hours of intense battle. Arrows had to be carefully matched to the bow. Too light and they lost power. Too heavy and they wouldn't fly true. A skilled archer could fire 10 to 12 arrows per minute, adjusting instinctively for distance and wind. Archery wasn't just a skill, it was a way of life. Daily practice was mandatory, and entire companies were fined for taking a single day off. Some archers called their bows their wives, both loved and resented. One, caught drinking excessively, defended himself by saying his bow demanded everything from him. So, at night, the ale was his alone. As demanding as this relationship was, the bow was just the beginning of an archer's burden. Packlight wasn't an option for medieval archers. When war called, they carried enough gear to make a modern soldier wince. Their burden wasn't just the emotional weight of impending battle, it was the very physical weight of survival tools strapped to their backs, hanging from their belts, and slung across their shoulders. The longbow itself was just the beginning. At 6 feet tall and up to 5 pounds, it was a challenge to carry. But without arrows, it was just an awkwardly shaped walking stick. And arrows? Those weren't travel-sized. A standard war archer carried 60 to 100 arrows, 7 to 12 pounds of pure pointy inconvenience. These weren't neatly packed in stylish back quivers like in movies. Most archers slung arrows at their hip, crammed them in boots, or just stabbed them into the ground and hoped no one tripped. Running out of ammo mid-battle was a death sentence, so archers carried materials to make more. Extra arrowheads, feathers, and wooden shafts. Smart ones had emergency fletching kits, because nothing adds to battlefield stress like crafting arts and crafts under fire. The bowstring was another issue. Rain made hemp strings stretch, so archers carried at least 3 backups wrapped in waxed cloth. Some tucked spares into pouches, others into their helmets. A few supposedly stored them in less mentionable body crevices. When your life depends on dry strings, dignity is optional. Armor? Archers got the short end of the stick. Most wore quilted jackets weighing 10 to 15 pounds, like fighting inside a mattress. The lucky ones had chainmail, adding 20 more pounds. Helmets weighed another 3 to 5. A buckler might add 3 more. Then came weapons. a dagger, hammer, or axe, because stabbing is plan A, but smashing is plan B. Food, water, cloaks, fire starters, and spare boots piled on extra weight. In total, archers hauled 60 to 80 pounds of misery. No wonder they joked they were half mule, half man, and that an archer without back pain is either dead or lying. When you've carried half your body weight across medieval terrain, actually shooting the bow is the easy part, but even the strongest backs needed to keep moving forward. Medieval warfare wasn't about showing up for a scheduled battle, it was about surviving the journey to get there. A brutal ordeal that claimed lives before a single arrow was fired. The day started before sunrise. No coffee, no energy drinks, just cold water and stale bread if you were lucky. Fires were often banned in hostile territory, meaning breakfast was as cold as your spirits. Then came the march, 20 miles a day, sometimes 30, carrying 80 pounds of gear. That's a marathon, daily, in flimsy boots and unpredictable weather. Roads? More like mud with extra suffering. Paved highways were rare, so armies trudged through dirt paths, open fields, and trails that seemed designed to break ankles. Maps were rudimentary at best, so guides, sometimes unreliable ones, led the way. A French chronicler described English archers as moving like a plague of locusts, their feet so hardened that rocks seemed to yield. That wasn't poetic. It was a bitter complaint from people watching their land get trampled. The footwear situation was grim. Archers typically had one pair of leather boots, thin soles, no padding, definitely not waterproof. When they wore out, replacements came from whatever was available, including cloth wrappings or even scavenged leather from the battlefield. Some hardened their feet in advance by walking barefoot on gravel or rubbing them with salt and vinegar. Weather turned everything into a nightmare. Summer meant heat stroke, winter meant frostbite, rain meant misery for all. Cold soaked everything, gear got heavier, and bowstrings became useless. Some armies just stopped moving when the rain was too bad, preferring delay over drowning in mud. Sleep was a luxury, no tents unless you were nobility. Most archers slept on the ground, wrapped in cloaks, hoping bugs wouldn't feast on them. Food? Hard bread that needed soaking to be edible, dried meat tougher than armor, and foraging, a polite term for taking whatever you found. By the time they reached battle, archers were already half dead. Unfortunately for their enemies, that made them twice as dangerous. The march might break bodies, but it forged resolute spirits, and those spirits would need every ounce of resolve once the actual fighting began. Archers weren't just guys with bows. They were highly trained specialists operating with the precision of medieval artillery units. Their formations turned battlefields into giant screaming pincushions. The basic archer formation, shoulder to shoulder in long lines, seemed simple, but every detail was carefully planned. Terrain, wind, sun position, enemy movement, commanders treated battlefields like oversized chessboards. A slight rise in the ground meant better range. A forest behind them prevented cavalry from flanking. Sun in the enemy's eyes? Bonus points for making knights squint. Archers didn't stand in straight rows. They formed a slight curve, not just to look fancy, but to make their arrows converge on targets from multiple angles. This increased the kill zone, making dodging a near impossible task. The math behind these volleys was terrifying. A well-trained archer could fire 10 to 12 arrows per minute. 100 archers? Over 1,000 arrows per minute. At Agincourt, 6,000 English archers participated, meaning they would rain down 60,000 arrows a minute. That's not a battle. That's a weather report. But this wasn't random shooting. Against infantry, volleys came in continuous waves, forcing enemies to advance while being turned into medieval porcupines. Against cavalry, archers planted stakes in the ground to stop horses while aiming at both the riders and their terrified, soon-to-be riderless mounts. Arrows weren't just fast, they were lethal. A war arrow from a longbow hit speeds of 160 feet per second and could penetrate 4 inches of oak. Chainmail might as well be a t-shirt. Even plate armor had weak spots that arrows could exploit. Communication was just as sophisticated. Voice commands were useless in battle, so archers relied on flag signals, horn blasts, and drums. Medieval drumline? More like a medieval death beat. Wind, rain, and terrain were factored in like a brutal physics experiment. Crosswinds? Adjust formation. Rain, adjust aim, narrow battlefield. make the enemy stack up like a human sandwich. The result? Archers changed medieval warfare forever, and if you were on the receiving end, the only question was whether you'd die first, or just wish you had. But even the most sophisticated tactics couldn't prevent the battle from eventually getting personal. When enemies closed the distance and the last arrow had been fired, science gave way to desperate survival. Unlike modern soldiers who might call for extraction or reinforcement, medieval archers faced a simple, terrifying truth. They had to fight hand-to-hand against enemies who were often better equipped, better armored, and absolutely furious about watching their comrades fall to arrow fire. This transition happened in several ways, none of them pleasant. Sometimes enemies simply outlasted the arrow supply. A typical archer carried 60 to 100 arrows, which could be depleted within 15 minutes of intense combat. Medieval supply chains couldn't exactly airdrop ammunition. Once you shot your last shaft, you were officially in the close combat business. Other times, cavalry or infantry broke through protective lines, forcing archers into immediate melee. In these moments, archers reached for their secondary weapons, tools that revealed just how desperate they were. The standard backup was a simple dagger useful for eating and camp tasks, but tragically inadequate against a mounted knight with a 5-foot sword. Some wielded mauls, essentially wooden hammers with metal striking surfaces. A solid hit could dent armor, but getting close enough to swing one meant volunteering for a starring role in a medieval cautionary tale. Others carried small axes, repurposed from woodcutting, which could hook shields or penetrate armor at weak points. The most desperate archers weaponized their bows. A 6-foot yew longbow made a passable staff, and some even modified them with metal caps. Medieval art shows archers trying to trip knights with bows or block sword strikes, rarely successfully. The mismatch was brutal. Knights trained in close combat from childhood, wearing 60 pounds of armor and wielding weapons crafted by master smiths. Against them stood the archer, typically wearing a gambeson, wielding a converted tool, and trained only in bow use. One medieval writer described this as a mouse battling a cat, albeit a mouse who earlier killed the cat's entire family. Not all archers died. Some escaped, others survived with injuries, and a few even captured enemy weapons. But once an archer ran out of arrows, survival often became a matter of sheer luck. This transition from ranged warfare to desperate close combat represents one of history's starkest battlefield role reversals. In minutes, elite distance killers became underdogs fighting for bare survival. For those who somehow survived this ordeal, yet another challenge awaited, one that no weapon could defeat. Medieval battlefield medicine combined genuine knowledge with treatments so bizarre and dangerous they often finished what enemy weapons started. For archers who survived combat, the real fight was just beginning. Arrow wounds were ironically common among archers themselves. Friendly fire incidents were frequent in the chaos of battle. These punctures caused extensive internal damage, and medieval surgeons called arrows that passed clean through fortunate wounds since they could at least be cleaned from both sides. Extraction was a nightmare. Specialized tools like the crow's beak gripped embedded arrowheads, but success rates hovered around 50%. The other 50% got an early retirement plan, just not the kind they wanted. Melee wounds presented different problems. Clean sword cuts sometimes healed, but ragged slashes and crushed limbs often led to gangrene. Amputation was the only option, but survival rates were grim. The first treatment for most wounds was wine, not for drinking, but for pouring directly into injuries. It turns out medieval doctors and modern bartenders agreed on at least one thing: alcohol fixes everything. Wound closure was a horror show. Surgeons stitched wounds with boar bristles and horsehair, often without sterilization. Cauterization with hot iron stopped bleeding, but created infected burn tissue. Recovery locations were worse. Field hospitals packed wounded soldiers onto straw mats, blood and pus pooling together. Cross-contamination wasn't just a risk, it was practically encouraged. Medieval infection theory was questionable at best. Surgeons blamed festering wounds on bad air and corrupt blood, treating them with honey, helpful, and animal dung, not so much. Pain management was mostly alcohol or opium if available. Otherwise, patients got a leather strap to bite and a doctor with selective hearing. Many archers never returned to battle. Hand and arm injuries made drawing a warbow impossible, leaving them disabled with few economic options. Some veterans self-mutilated to avoid recall, severing fingers to make themselves unfit for duty. When cutting off a finger sounds like the best career move, you know the job has some issues. Having survived training, marching, battle, and wounds, an archer might think the worst was behind them. Medieval archers didn't exactly enjoy lucrative compensation packages for their dangerous services. The financial reality of this profession was as brutal as the physical demands, creating a life of perpetual economic insecurity for those who survived long enough to worry about money. A skilled longbowman during the 100 Years' War earned approximately 6 pence per day while on active campaign, roughly twice what an average laborer might make. This might sound reasonable until you consider the actual purchasing power. 6 pence would buy about 2 gallons of ale or one modest meal at a tavern. Archers weren't starving, but they certainly weren't saving for retirement either. Payment schedules added another layer of frustration. Wages were supposed to be distributed weekly or monthly, but medieval payroll systems were notoriously unreliable. Military treasurers often ran out of funds partway through campaigns. Archers sometimes went months without payment, expected to continue fighting effectively while essentially working for IOUs from their lords or the crown. This payment uncertainty led directly to one of the most controversial aspects of archer economics: looting. Unpaid or underpaid archers naturally turned to battlefield salvage and civilian plunder to supplement their incomes. While officially discouraged outside specific circumstances, looting was tacitly accepted as a necessary evil to keep armies functioning when official payment systems failed. The value of battlefield salvage could exceed an archer's annual salary. A captured knight's armor might be worth over 5 pounds, the equivalent of 6 months' wages. Even more modest finds like serviceable boots, weapons, or horses represented significant windfalls. Medieval military described fierce competition among archers to strip valuable items from battlefields before their comrades could claim them. Between campaigns, the financial picture grew even bleaker. Professional archers were expected to maintain their skills and equipment while receiving no pay during non-campaign periods. Many took up seasonal agricultural work or practiced trades like carpentry or blacksmithing during these gaps. Others joined tournament circuits, performing archery exhibitions for the meager prizes and audience donations. Injury compensation barely existed. An archer who lost a draw hand might receive a one-time payment of a few shillings, hardly enough to support them through a lifetime of disability. Some lords provided small land grants to their most loyal or effective archers, but these were exceptions rather than standard practice. Medical expenses came directly from the archer's own pocket, often depleting any savings accumulated during active service. Retirement planning consisted primarily of "don't get old," almost no mention of pension systems for common soldiers like archers. The expected retirement path was to save enough to purchase a small plot of land or set up a modest business. Given the pay scales involved, this remained an unattainable dream for most. The financial reality becomes clear in medieval tax and census records, which reveal that former military archers typically fell into the lowest economic brackets in their communities. Many ended up as day laborers, taking whatever work their aging and damaged bodies could manage. Some leveraged their skills by becoming archery instructors for the next generation, but these positions were few and poorly compensated. The final financial insult often came after death. Many veteran archers ended up in paupers' graves, having exhausted whatever resources they had accumulated during their final illnesses. The same hands that had defended kingdoms couldn't afford proper burials for themselves. Beyond the financial hardships, archers faced another challenge that cut just as deep. Medieval society operated on a rigid hierarchy where birth largely determined worth. Within this system, archers occupied a peculiar middle ground, too valuable to ignore, too common to truly respect. Their social position fluctuated with political winds and military needs, creating a class of men who never quite belonged anywhere. During peacetime, archers melted back into the lower classes from which they came. Former military bowmen became cobblers, innkeepers, and gravediggers. One day, they were raining death on the enemy. The next, they were serving ale to a guy who had never left his village. Their military service carried little social currency in civilian life. No special recognition, no guaranteed wealth. The aristocracy viewed archers with a mix of disdain and grudging appreciation. Medieval literature, written by and for nobles, frequently depicts them as crude and unrefined. Yet these same texts acknowledge their battlefield effectiveness. One French nobleman famously complained that archery was an unfair art that allows the lowborn to kill their betters from a distance, perhaps the highest backhanded compliment ever paid to the profession. Common folk had their own contradictory views. Returning archers often faced suspicion. These were men who had witnessed atrocities, participated in looting, and survived brutal battles. Some communities even enacted ordinances against trouble from returned bowmen, suggesting their battlefield behaviors didn't always fade once they were home. The church added another layer of complexity. Official doctrine condemned missile weapons used against fellow Christians, with papal bulls specifically targeting crossbows and longbows. This left many archers in a moral bind, celebrated by kings, damned by their priests. Some tried to buy spiritual forgiveness with large church donations. Others simply hoped their accuracy on the battlefield might impress St. Peter. Women's perspectives were equally complicated. Archers had decent incomes during service, making them attractive providers. However, their frequent absences and high mortality rates made them unreliable long-term partners. Some towns even had noticeably higher widow rates in areas known for supplying archers. The phrase, "till death do us part," probably hit a little too close to home. Children viewed archers with both awe and dread. Boys admired them but feared being selected for training. Recruiters arriving in villages were met with a peculiar mix of excitement and hidden sons. Mothers stuffed their strongest boys into cellars while fathers reluctantly presented them, knowing survival depended on having a useful skill. Ultimately, archers lived between worlds, respected in war, tolerated in peace, but rarely fully integrated into society. They mastered a weapon so demanding it altered their bodies, faced dangers that would terrify modern soldiers, and did it all for wages that barely kept them fed. So, do you think you have what it takes to be a medieval archer? If so, congratulations. You've got more grit than most knights who ever wore fancy armor. What did rich people eat in medieval times? Let's just say, if you were rich, your meals weren't just meals, they were a statement. Eating wasn't about hunger, it was about proving you had more money, more connections, and way better taste than everyone else. The bigger, rarer, and more outrageous the food, the better. But first, let's look at the over-the-top meals that turned dining into a spectacle. Back then, a noble's banquet wasn't just a meal, it was an entire production. When a high-ranking lord hosted a feast, every detail showed off their wealth. Tables would bend under the weight of dozens of dishes brought out in carefully planned sequences. Each course might include up to 20 different foods. One famous feast served over 50 distinct dishes, forcing guests to pace themselves or risk missing the grand finale. Presentation mattered just as much as the food itself. Picture walking into a great hall to see peacocks roasted and then reassembled with all their colorful feathers looking almost alive on the table. These nobles didn't just eat a bird, they wanted it dressed better than they were. Or imagine a giant pie that, when cut open, released live birds to fly around the room. Yes, that really happened. Cooks became master artists, creating elaborate centerpieces called subtleties between courses. These weren't just decorations, they were edible art made from sugar paste, marzipan, and jelly. A skilled cook might create an entire sugar castle complete with tiny knights, or animals that looked incredibly realistic. The foods themselves were chosen specifically to showcase wealth. Anything rare, anything that had to travel far, anything that cost a fortune. That's what nobles wanted. Oranges from distant lands, rice from far away, almonds and exotic spices that cost more per pound than a peasant would earn in a year. You know you're rich when your dessert costs more than your servant's house. Special wines would be imported at massive expense, often sweetened and spiced to create what they called hippocress. Servants made sure no cup remained empty for long. One royal feast showed over 300 barrels of wine were consumed by the guests. Nothing says, "I'm important," like making sure everyone at your party is too drunk to remember how important you are. Competition between nobles meant these feasts got more elaborate over time. If your rival served 40 dishes at his celebration, you'd better serve 50 at yours. One Christmas feast featured a table 165 feet long used just for the first course. These extravagant displays served a political purpose too. They weren't just about stuffing faces. Every guest's seating position told them exactly where they stood in the social order. The food at a medieval feast was a language that everyone understood: power, displayed through excess. While the feast table overflowed with fancy dishes and exotic treats, the real star of the noble diet was something they ate day in and day out. Medieval nobles built their meals around meat. While common folk might taste meat on special holidays, the wealthy devoured it daily. The medieval noble diet plan was simple. If it moved, eat it, preferably in front of people who couldn't afford it. Court records show that nobles consumed astonishing amounts, up to 5 pounds of meat per day. That equals about 20 modern hamburgers. In just 3 months, a wealthy lord would eat roughly his own body weight in animal flesh. One duke reportedly consumed 6 entire swans during a 12-day feast, along with countless other meats. The variety of meats at noble tables went far beyond what we eat today. Beef, pork, and chicken? Those were everyday fare. The elite hunted for tastier game: deer, wild boar, and hare. These animals weren't just food, but symbols of status that showed off both hunting skill and land ownership. Castle kitchens often employed specialized cooks just for game meats, with their own prep areas and equipment. Not everyone could hunt as they pleased. Laws strictly protected certain animals, especially deer, in royal forests. The penalties for poaching were brutal, from losing a hand to losing your life. Medieval game wardens didn't just give you a ticket, they gave you a permanent disability. For truly special occasions, the rarest meats appeared. Swans adorned royal tables, considered too prestigious for anyone but the highest nobility. Peacocks made dramatic centerpieces at fancy dinners. Herons, cranes, and storks, birds we now protect, were delicacies for the wealthy few. Many castles maintained dedicated bird gardens just to ensure fresh, exotic fowl was always available. The strangest meats came from the water. Porpoises and dolphins regularly featured in noble meals, especially during religious fasting days when land animals were forbidden. The church had oddly classified these mammals as fish, creating a convenient loophole. These nobles took, "There are plenty of fish in the sea," a bit too literally. Beaver tails made the acceptable fish list, too. Since beavers spend time in water and have scaly tails, religious authorities counted them as fish. This meant beaver tail could appear on the menu during Lent and other fast days. Recipe books from the time suggest roasting it and serving it with spicy pepper sauce. Monasteries often kept special beaver ponds to ensure a steady supply during long religious fasting periods. Medieval cooks became masters of meat transformation. They would reassemble cooked animals to look alive again, or create mythical beasts by sewing different creatures together. One famous dish, called cockentrice, combined the front half of a pig with the back half of a rooster, served standing as if it were a real animal. If Dr. Frankenstein had been a chef, this would have been his signature dish. Even ordinary noble dinners featured incredible variety. A typical evening meal included 3 to 5 different meats, each prepared uniquely. Castle kitchen records list dinners with 12 different meat dishes served at once. The most skilled servants could identify a lord's status just by counting the meat varieties on their table. This meat obsession had a medical excuse too. The health theories of the time claimed that different foods suited different social classes. Meat was considered hot and moist, qualities thought perfect for active nobles. Vegetables were deemed cold and dry, supposedly better for peasants who worked the fields. Court physicians actually prescribed specific meats for different ailments: venison for fever, pork for strength, and fowl for intelligence. All this meat would seem bland by itself, which is why wealthy nobles turned to another luxury to make their food truly special. Spices ruled the medieval noble kitchen. These dried seeds, fruits, bark, and roots from distant lands turned ordinary food into statements of power and wealth. If medieval nobles had Instagram, their food posts would all be tagged #SpiceGoals. Getting spices to Europe was no easy task. Pepper grew only in India. Cinnamon came from islands thousands of miles away. Nutmeg and cloves grew on tiny spots of land in Indonesia. These treasures changed hands many times, traveling by ship, camel, and horse across oceans and deserts before reaching noble tables. Each trader marked up the price, making spices worth their weight in precious metals. Just how costly were these flavor bombs? Court records tell us a pound of ginger cost the same as a whole sheep. A pound of nutmeg equaled 7 oxen in value. Cloves went for hundreds of dollars per pound in today's money. The king of all spices, saffron, sometimes cost more than actual gold. This makes sense when you learn it takes roughly 75,000 flowers to make just 1 pound of saffron threads. Entire cities became rich just moving spices from east to west. Venice grew from a muddy island town to a major power largely by controlling spice routes. Spice merchants built huge mansions and became so wealthy they loaned money to royalty. These pepper dealers were the original drug lords, but their products were legal and sprinkled on food. The noble love for spices went beyond reason. Kitchen manuscripts revealed dishes drowning in expensive seasonings. One chicken recipe called for 6 types of spice plus 3 kinds of sugar. A fish dish popular at royal tables used 23 different spices in a single serving. Medieval taste buds must have been much stronger than ours to handle such intense flavors. Food color mattered as much as taste. Rich hosts wanted meals that looked expensive too. Saffron made dishes golden yellow. Sandalwood turned sauces bright red. Some cooks even used ground azure stone for blue food. That's right. Medieval nobles ate actual crushed gemstones just to impress guests with colorful meals. Would we enjoy these heavily spiced foods today? Probably not. Medieval recipes mixed flavors in ways modern tongues would find strange. Cinnamon with fish, pepper with fruit, ginger with everything. But good taste wasn't the goal. Showing off was. The more spices you piled on food, the more important you seemed. Spices became such status symbols that laws restricted who could use them. In some areas, common people caught with saffron faced heavy fines. Other spices were legally reserved just for nobles. Guards would actually raid homes looking for illegal spice stashes. Medieval paprika police were a real thing. Keeping these treasures safe required serious measures. Castle kitchens had special locked spice rooms with guarded access. Many wealthy houses employed spice masters whose only job was caring for these precious seasonings. These experts carried special keys and knew secret mixing recipes for the best flavor combinations. While these exotic seasonings dominated the noble dinner table and emptied royal treasuries, they were just one part of the elaborate food system that separated the haves from the have-nots in medieval society. The next essential element of noble dining was equally important for showing status, though it came in a very different form. Bread wasn't just food in medieval times. It was a social identifier that instantly revealed your rank. Medieval bread was basically the original class ID card, except you could eat it. The finest bread, called manchet, was reserved for nobility. Made from wheat flour sifted multiple times through linen cloths, manchet was prized for its white color. Each sifting removed more bran and germ, wasting about 30% of the grain. Rich people literally threw away food to make their bread look prettier. Medieval influencer culture at its finest. A lord received white manchet loaves, while servants got darker, cheap bread. Court bakers followed exact rules about who deserved which type. Breaking these bread protocols could result in punishment. Bread was serious business. The middle classes ate maslin, a mix of wheat and rye flours that produced a light brown loaf. Less expensive than manchet, but still respectable, maslin was the bread of merchants and skilled workers. It was the medieval equivalent of driving a sensible mid-range sedan. Not flashy, but you weren't embarrassed to be seen with it. Poor people's bread was dark, dense, and often mixed with fillers. During hard times, peasants added ground peas, beans, acorns, or even sawdust to stretch their dough. In famines, tree bark might find its way into the mix. These loaves were heavy and sometimes dangerous. Rye could develop ergot fungus, causing hallucinations or death. Nothing says tough times like bread that might kill you or make you see dragons. One clever use of bread was as an edible plate called a trencher. These thick slices of day-old bread served as plates for meat and saucy dishes. After eating the main food, nobles would give these gravy-soaked trenchers to servants or poor people waiting outside. This was medieval recycling. The plates got eaten, and the nobles got to feel generous while getting rid of their trash. Royal kitchens consumed enormous amounts of bread. One feast required over 6,000 loaves of various types. Large noble households employed multiple bakers working in shifts with dedicated ovens that rarely cooled. Some noble estates spent more on bread than they did on the salaries of all their guards combined. While bread revealed your importance in society, true nobility finished their meals with something far more exotic and expensive. Sugar was the medieval equivalent of flashing a platinum credit card. When sugar first arrived in Europe, it wasn't just food, it was basically edible jewelry. If a noble offered you something sweet, they weren't being nice. They were showing off that they could afford to eat something that cost more than your house. Getting sugar to European tables was no small feat. Sugarcane grew in faraway tropical places, and processing it required countless hours of labor. Workers cut the cane, crushed it, boiled down the juice, and purified it through multiple stages. The final product arrived as rock-hard cones that had to be broken apart with special tools. Medieval sugar was so hard, you could probably use it as a weapon in an emergency. How expensive are we talking? According to medieval account books, a pound of sugar cost roughly what a skilled craftsman earned in an entire week. For comparison, that would be like paying several $100s for a bag of sugar today. Most people used honey as their sweetener, but serving honey at a noble feast would be a major social blunder. The desserts nobles enjoyed were shockingly extravagant. They ate marzipan molded into fantastic shapes, fruit jellies made from animal hooves, and wafers pressed with intricate designs. The medieval rich were basically eating art projects while everyone else was just trying not to starve. The crown jewel of sweet displays was the subtlety. Elaborate sugar sculptures presented between feast courses. These weren't simple decorations, but massive artistic creations, often with hidden meanings or political messages. A subtlety might depict a castle complete with towers, a scene from mythology, or even mechanical creations that moved when presented. These sugar sculptures were the medieval version of those over-the-top Instagram desserts that looked too pretty to eat, except they cost more than a farmer's yearly income. Candied fruits and nuts were noble favorites too. Expensive imported oranges, lemons, and dates were preserved in sugar syrup, creating treats enjoyed year-round. Comfits, spices coated in layers of hardened sugar, helped freshen breath after meals, and came in decorative boxes that cost more than the sweets inside. Sugar wasn't just for eating either. Court physicians prescribed it as medicine for various ailments. Medieval doctors basically wrote prescriptions for candy, which might explain why their patients kept coming back with toothaches. Serving these sweets involved an elaborate ceremony. Desserts arrived during the final course, presented by special servers, sometimes accompanied by musicians. Small decorated sticks or two-pronged forks helped nobles eat sticky treats without soiling their fingers. All these sweet indulgences naturally left nobles thirsty for something appropriate to wash them down. Medieval nobles avoided plain water like it was the plague, which it sometimes caused. Water sources were often contaminated, making wine the safer option. Rich people treated water the way modern teenagers treat vegetables, something to be avoided at all costs unless absolutely necessary. Wine dominated noble tables. The most prestigious came from French and German vineyards, costing a fortune to import. Castle records show some nobles spent up to 20% of their household budget just on wine. Their wine cellars were basically medieval bank vaults where the currency was fermented grape juice. The amount nobles drank would make modern doctors faint. Court documents reveal daily allowances of 1 gallon of wine per noble person. That's 8 bottles by today's standards, per day. Breakfast wine was completely normal. Dinner wine was expected. Bedtime wine helped you sleep. Medieval nobles weren't alcoholics, they were wine enthusiasts with very dedicated drinking schedules. Fancy drinks went beyond basic wine. Hot spiced wine called hippocras mixed cinnamon, ginger, and sugar into imported wines. Mead, fermented honey, offered variety for special occasions. Beer existed but faced a serious image problem, considered too common for noble tastes. Offering beer to a medieval noble was like bringing boxed wine to a modern fancy dinner party. Technically, alcohol, but a major social blunder. Drinking vessels mattered as much as the drinks themselves. Wealthy nobles used cups made of silver or gold, sometimes decorated with jewels. Special maplewood cups called mazers had precious metal rims. Some even drank from elaborately decorated animal horns during ceremonies. The fancier your cup, the more important you obviously were. Wine tasting existed even then, with trusted servants called wine stewards who sampled drinks before serving them. They checked for spoilage and poison. Being a medieval wine taster required either a very brave soul or very little survival instinct. Many castles featured built-in wine delivery systems, actual pipes running through walls that brought wine directly from cellars to dining halls. These medieval drink faucets meant nobles never had to wait for refills. They basically invented the world's first drink dispensers, proving that humans will go to extraordinary lengths to avoid walking to get another drink. While nobles enjoyed their rivers of wine, they also sought out foods that nobody else could get. Medieval nobles loved showing off by eating foods no one else could get. The stranger and more expensive the food, the better it proved their status. Rich people back then would eat almost anything as long as it was difficult to find and cost a fortune. Their dinner parties were basically fear factor with fancy tablecloths. Whale meat topped the list of strange noble foods. Any whale that washed ashore automatically belonged to the ruler in many kingdoms. The tongue was considered the best part and always went to the most important person at the table. Cooks would salt the blubber to preserve it and roast the meat or make it into fancy stews. Nothing said, "I'm important," quite like eating an endangered species that could swallow your entire fishing fleet. Sea mammals like porpoises and dolphins regularly appeared at noble feasts. Religious rules allowed these animals on fasting days because they lived in water, even though they breathed air. Account books from castles show porpoise meat cost 40 times more than regular fish. When a noble told you they were fasting, it meant they were only eating dolphins instead of deer. Such sacrifice. Medieval dietary restrictions had more loopholes than tax laws. Tiny birds made surprisingly popular noble meals. Larks, thrushes, and finches were caught, roasted, and served by the dozen. Eating these tiny birds proved wealth because someone had to spend all day catching enough for just one meal. Some dishes required 60 small birds at once. Imagine spending all day chasing tiny birds just so your lord could get one mouthful per bird. Job security was terrible, but cardio opportunities were excellent. The strangest bird on noble menus was the barnacle goose. These geese bred in such far northern places that no one saw them nesting or laying eggs. This created a weird belief that these birds actually grew from barnacles stuck on floating wood. This mistaken idea let nobles eat them during religious fasting periods when most meats were forbidden. Medieval menu loophole. If you can make up a fish-related backstory for your food, you can eat it on Fridays. This is why no one trusted a hungry noble with a good imagination. Even ice counted as a luxury food. Rich households built special underground storage areas where winter ice could be kept for months under layers of straw. Summer guests would be amazed by chilled drinks and frozen treats. Medieval nobility invented refrigeration not for medicine or food safety, but because room temperature wine was apparently a fate worse than plague. Foods from far away proved a noble had trading connections. Rice traveled from distant eastern lands. Citrus fruits came from Mediterranean regions. Dates, figs, and pomegranates journeyed weeks or months to reach northern dinner tables. Fruits arrived so overripe that guests needed to be genuinely wealthy to afford the dental work after biting into what was essentially fermented fruit leather. Many common vegetables were actually avoided by the wealthy. Turnips, carrots, and other root vegetables were seen as poor people's food. Nobles eating too many vegetables might be mocked for having cheap tastes. Medieval nobles were the original picky eaters, turning up their noses at perfectly good carrots while happily munching on whale blubber and barnacle birds. Some of the most expensive noble foods were believed to have magical powers. What they called unicorn horn, actually the tusk of a narwhal, was ground into powder and eaten as medicine by the super rich. Ambergris, a waxy substance from whale digestive systems, flavored noble foods despite its bizarre origin. Yes, the fanciest medieval nobles literally paid top gold to eat whale vomit and narwhal tusks, and they thought peasant food was gross. Through these strange and exotic food choices, medieval nobles created clear boundaries between themselves and ordinary people. Their unusual eating habits weren't just about taste, they were a powerful way to show status that everyone understood without a word being spoken. Growing food in a freezing climate wasn't just difficult, it was a fight for survival. One mistake could mean an empty storage room when winter hits. But medieval farmers weren't helpless. They had methods, strategies, and a few clever tricks, starting with something that made all the difference before winter even arrived. As the air turned chilly and daylight faded, villages got busy. Farmers worked fast, knowing their survival depended on what they did before the frost set in. The first task? Deep plowing. Using strong wooden plows with iron tips, pulled by oxen, they broke up the soil before it became rock hard. If they waited too long, the ground would be so frozen, they might as well try ice skating on it. This early plowing helped the soil stay loose and full of nutrients through winter. Manure was extremely valuable in medieval times. Farmers collected every dropping from their livestock and spread it across fields in thick layers. Then they'd add straw and fallen leaves on top. This mulch kept the soil warmer, sometimes 10 degrees warmer, and slowly broke down to feed the earth with nutrients. Farmers back then were the original recyclers, turning poop into gold long before anyone thought of going green. Water management was another crucial skill. Nothing killed crops faster than waterlogged soil that froze solid. Using simple wooden spades, medieval farmers dug networks of ditches. Some villages had drainage systems several miles long. These channels guided excess water away from fields, preventing the deadly freezing that would push young plants out of the ground. These drainage experts could have taught modern plumbers a thing or two about preventing frozen pipes. The timing of this preparation followed specific patterns. Many communities had special days marked for plowing based on seasons and moon phases. Some believed land prepared during a waning moon would yield better harvests, a belief some farmers still follow today. By the time the first snow fell, medieval fields looked empty but were actually full of potential, waiting for spring. The careful work done in autumn made all the difference between having food or going hungry. With the land now ready, medieval farmers faced their next challenge. Medieval farmers needed to choose plants tough enough to handle freezing weather. They couldn't just grow anything they wanted. Years of trying different crops taught them which ones could survive harsh winters. Winter grains became the most important crops in cold areas. Rye was especially valuable because it could grow in places too cold for other grains. This sturdy plant was like the medieval version of a polar bear swimmer. It actually enjoyed jumping into freezing conditions. Farmers planted rye seeds in late autumn, where they would sleep under snow all winter. As soon as temperatures rose slightly in spring, these seeds would start growing, giving farmers extra weeks of growing time. Rye was incredibly important in cold regions. Remains found in old villages show that more than 70% of grain grown in northern Europe was rye. Most people ate rye bread every single day. Tough vegetables were also essential for survival. Turnips, cabbages, and onions could handle light frost without dying. Farmers planted these in late summer so they would be almost fully grown before the first hard freeze. Cabbage was especially useful because one plant provided many meals. Cabbage was the Swiss Army knife of medieval vegetables. It could be eaten fresh, cooked, or turned into sauerkraut that lasted for months. Medieval farmers also discovered that growing certain plants together helped both types survive. Beans and peas would grow up the stalks of grains like natural ladders. At the same time, these climbing plants put nutrients back into the soil that helped the grain grow better. These plants had the perfect friendship. One offered support while the other shared food. Another clever method was planting short crops between taller ones. The big plants blocked harsh winds, creating a warmer spot for smaller, more fragile plants. Old records showed this type of mixed planting could increase how much food farmers harvested by up to 25%, often making the difference between having enough to eat or going hungry. With their cold, hardy plants in the ground, medieval farmers still faced their next struggle. It's creating warmth to protect their crops when temperatures plummeted. They developed clever methods to shield plants from freezing without any modern technology. Manure hotbeds were one of their most brilliant solutions. Fresh animal waste naturally heats up as it decomposes. Farmers dug shallow trenches, filled them with fresh manure, and added a thin layer of soil on top before planting. These medieval farmers knew their poop was valuable long before modern gardeners paid good money for bags of manure at garden centers. The decomposing waste could make the soil 15 degrees warmer than surrounding areas for several weeks. This extra warmth kept roots from freezing and allowed plants to continue growing despite the cold air. Wind protection was another key strategy. Cold winds could damage plants that might otherwise survive low temperatures. Farmers created windbreaks called wattles by weaving flexible branches into fences. These barriers blocked harsh winds while still allowing sunlight to reach the plants. Gardens sheltered by wattle fencing produced nearly 30% more food than exposed gardens in the same area. Medieval farmers also invented early versions of greenhouses. They crafted protective covers called cloches from glass or clay. These bell-shaped covers were placed over individual plants to trap heat. Medieval vegetables got tucked in at night with their very own glass blankets, much better treatment than the farmers themselves often received. During daylight hours, the sun would warm the air inside, and this warmth stayed trapped at night when temperatures dropped. For larger areas, farmers built cold frames, wooden boxes with transparent tops that protected entire rows of plants. For especially important crops, some farmers constructed slanted frames covered with oiled parchment that allowed sunlight to enter while keeping cold air out. These simple structures could extend growing seasons by up to 40 days in some places. The most successful medieval gardens used all these methods together. Wattle fences formed the outer defense, with manure hotbeds warming from below and cloches protecting from above. With their crops now shielded from the worst of winter's bite, medieval farmers looked to another source of warmth. Beyond creating artificial warmth with manure and protective covers, medieval farmers became experts at finding and using natural heat sources already present in their environment. They mastered the art of working with nature rather than fighting against it. Stone walls served as more than just boundaries between fields. Clever farmers planted their most delicate crops along south-facing stone walls for good reason. During the day, sunlight would warm these stone structures. As temperatures dropped at night, the stones slowly released this stored heat, creating a microclimate several degrees warmer than the surrounding area. These medieval walls didn't just keep out wild animals, they doubled as free heating systems when the sun went down. In particularly cold regions, some communities built curved stone walls that focused this heat effect even more, creating pockets where frost-sensitive plants could survive. Field placement was carefully planned based on the sun's path. South-facing slopes received up to 40% more sunlight than flat ground in northern regions. This extra solar energy meant warmer soil and better growing conditions. Medieval farmers would reserve these prime growing spots for their most important or vulnerable crops. Written records from monastery gardens show that herbs planted on south-facing slopes matured up to 2 weeks earlier than those in less favorable positions. Perhaps the most creative use of natural heat came from the strategic placement of gardens near livestock pens. The body heat from animals actually warmed the surrounding air enough to make a difference for nearby plants. Medieval farmers knew their animals were good for more than just milk and meat. They were walking furnaces that kept the vegetables cozy too. A large barn with 20 cows could raise the air temperature in adjacent areas by as much as 4 degrees on cold nights. This small difference could save an entire crop from a killing frost. Some innovative communities even built living quarters and animal shelters on the north side of garden plots, creating a windbreak while also allowing heat from daily activities to benefit their food production. Smoke vents from cooking fires were sometimes directed to flow under raised growing beds before exiting, providing valuable warmth to plant roots. With their growing areas warmed by both artificial and natural heat sources, medieval farmers faced their next challenge. Medieval farmers needed to preserve seeds and plant materials to start growing again when winter ended. Their storage methods worked surprisingly well without any modern technology. Seeds were a farmer's most valuable possession. Without them, next year's crops wouldn't exist. Drying seeds properly came first. After harvest, farmers spread seeds on cloth in warm, sunny places until completely dry. They knew moisture would cause seeds to rot or sprout too early. These medieval farmers knew the rules for seed storage before any gardening book was written. Keep them dry, dark, and tell them bedtime stories about becoming mighty oaks. Once dried, seeds went into clay pots. These containers kept out mice and insects while allowing just enough air to prevent mold. Clay pots can maintain steady humidity levels that keep seeds alive for years. Some villages added herbs like tansy to their seed storage to drive away bugs. Many seeds stayed best in cool temperatures just above freezing. Underground cellars or rooms dug into hillsides provided these conditions naturally. Some medieval seed storage rooms kept temperature changes within 5 degrees all year. Quite impressive without modern thermostats. Root vegetables for replanting needed different care. Carrots, turnips, and other roots were packed in slightly damp sand inside wooden barrels or stone-lined pits dug below the frost line. This method stopped them from drying out while preventing rot. These root vegetables basically went into cold sleep for the winter, like bears hibernating, but with more plans to be dinner later. Traditional root storage pits typically stayed between 33 and 40 degrees. perfect for keeping living plant tissue alive through winter. Small herbs often received special treatment. Many were potted and brought inside homes or monasteries where they could survive until spring. These living plants provided fresh seasonings during winter while ensuring new plants for the next growing season. While their carefully stored seeds and plants waited for warmer days, medieval farmers discovered that there was something that wasn't always their enemies. Winter cold might seem like an enemy to growing food, but medieval farmers found surprising ways to make snow and ice work for them. These creative methods turned winter problems into farming solutions. Snow acted as a natural blanket for many planted fields. A thick layer of snow actually protected dormant plants from the much colder air above it. During the worst cold snaps, temperatures under snow can be up to 30 degrees warmer than the exposed air. Medieval farmers knew snow was nature's electric blanket long before electricity was invented. Just plug in a snowstorm and watch your crops stay cozy. Winter wheat and rye particularly benefited from this snow protection. Fields that stayed snow-covered throughout winter often grew 20% more grain than fields where plants were exposed to freezing air. Clever water management using ice became another useful strategy. Farmers sometimes made shallow pools in autumn that would freeze during winter. As these ice sheets slowly melted in early spring, they provided steady water to nearby fields exactly when young plants needed it most. These medieval farmers were basically running the world's slowest irrigation system, frozen in winter but ready to deliver when spring hit the defrost button. This technique helped in areas that often faced dry periods in spring. Old farming records mention special ice fields that supplied water for up to 3 weeks during the important early growing season. The freezing and thawing cycle also helped improve difficult soil. Heavy clay soils that were almost impossible to work when wet became easier to manage after winter freezes broke them apart. Smart farmers would plow these soils in autumn and leave the rough furrows exposed to winter weather. The repeated freezing and thawing naturally broke the big clumps into smaller pieces, creating better soil for planting without extra work. Winter frost was the medieval version of a soil blender, breaking up chunks without requiring a single calorie of human effort. This technique can reduce spring planting work by as much as 40%. Winter barley fields made direct use of snowmelt. Seeds were sometimes planted just before the first expected snowfall. They stayed dormant but perfectly positioned to grow the moment temperatures rose and snow melted. The moisture from melting snow helped seeds sprout quickly and gave young plants protection against spring dry spells. Fields planted this way often sprouted 7 to 10 days earlier than those planted after all the snow had melted. With winter's cold now helping rather than hurting their farming efforts, medieval farmers turned their attention to another critical challenge. After growing their crops successfully, medieval farmers needed perfect timing for harvest. Picking at the right moment meant full storehouses instead of empty bellies during winter. Staggered harvesting became their winning strategy. Instead of gathering everything at once, farmers picked crops in carefully planned stages. Their harvest schedule was more detailed than a royal court's dancing lessons, though with much more practical results. Early harvests began with quick-growing vegetables while tougher crops stayed in the ground longer. Many villages created 5 or 6 different harvest zones, each picked at specific times based on generations of weather observations. Late-season root crops got special treatment. Vegetables like turnips and parsnips stayed in the ground until just before hard frost. These patient root vegetables were the procrastinators of the medieval garden, always waiting until the absolute last minute. The cool soil actually improved their flavor and storage life. Root vegetables harvested right before the first hard freeze can last up to 30% longer in storage than those dug up earlier, providing fresh food well into winter. Medieval farmers also turned frost into a flavor enhancer. Some crops, like kale and certain cabbages, taste sweeter after experiencing light frost. The cold causes these plants to convert starches into sugars, improving both taste and nutrition. Frost was basically nature's sugar sprinkle, turning bitter greens into medieval dessert. Monastery records suggest that kale harvested after 3 frosts contained up to 40% more vitamin C than summer-harvested greens. Timing these harvests required impressive weather knowledge. Communities developed prediction methods based on natural signs. Cloud patterns, animal behavior, and even onion skin thickness helped determine when killing frost would arrive. These folk methods correctly predicted first frost dates within 5 days over 70% of the time. With their harvests safely gathered before winter's grip tightened, medieval farmers still needed one more trick. Growing anything during freezing winter months seems impossible, yet medieval farmers managed to produce fresh greens even when snow covered the ground. Fresh vegetables provided crucial nutrition during winter months when most people relied on stored foods. Indoor herb gardens flourished in unexpected places. Monasteries led the way in winter growing, using their stone buildings to create protected growing spaces. Many monastery kitchens maintained small herb gardens in south-facing windows where plants like thyme, parsley, and chives could grow year-round. These monks were the original indoor plant parents, keeping their leafy babies alive long before Instagram made it trendy. The steady indoor temperatures and consistent care resulted in surprisingly productive growing spaces. Records from one German monastery show they harvested fresh herbs at least twice weekly throughout winter, providing vital vitamin C when scurvy threatened many communities. Heated compost gardens created warm growing spaces outdoors. Fresh manure and plant waste generate significant heat as they decompose, sometimes reaching temperatures above 100 degrees in the center of large piles. Clever medieval gardeners placed cold-tolerant greens like young kale and certain herbs near these decomposing heaps. These steaming piles of waste were medieval hot tubs for plants, without the awkward human conversations. The extra warmth allowed plants to grow slowly, even during cold periods. The area within 3 feet of a large compost heap can remain up to 20 degrees warmer than surrounding garden spaces, creating a perfect microclimate for winter greens. Sprouted grains provided another source of fresh winter greens. When other growing methods failed, people would sprout wheat, barley, and rye indoors. These sprouted grains could be grown in any container with minimal light and offered considerable nutritional benefits. Medieval sprouting was basically salad farming for lazy people. No weeding, no waiting months, just add water and wait. Sprouted grains contain up to 40% more nutrients than unsprouted grains and can be ready to eat in just 5 to 7 days. This quick-growing food source helped bridge the gap when other fresh foods became unavailable during the harshest winter weeks. Some communities built special growing chambers partially underground where the Earth's natural warmth provided some protection from freezing temperatures. South-facing rock walls absorbed sunlight during the day and released heat at night, creating a mini greenhouse effect. With these creative methods for producing winter greens established, medieval farmers still needed one more skill to survive year after year. Medieval farmers faced the challenge of keeping soil healthy through freezing winters without modern tools. Their clever soil methods made the difference between feast and famine when spring finally arrived. Rotating fields was their main strategy for keeping soil strong. They split their farmland into 3 big fields and used each one differently each year. In the first field, they planted winter grains. In the second, they grew spring crops. The third field they left empty on purpose. This was called fallow land. This empty field wasn't wasted space. The soil in this field got a full year to rest and rebuild its strength. Studies of old farm records show this simple rotation boosted food production by about 1/3 compared to constantly used fields. Adding natural fertilizers kept their soil rich even in cold weather. Wood ash from cooking fires contained minerals that plants needed. Instead of tossing it out, farmers collected this ash and spread it on their fields. Crushed animal bones mixed into soil added important nutrients that helped plants grow stronger roots, exactly what crops needed to survive the harsh winter. A farmer might joke that feeding bones to the soil was like feeding the earth itself breakfast. Cover crops protected bare soil after harvest. As soon as one crop came out, medieval farmers quickly planted fast-growing plants like clover. These plants had amazing powers. They could take nitrogen from the air and store it in little bumps on their roots. When farmers dug these plants into the soil in spring, all that nitrogen became food for new crops. Plus, these cover plants kept precious topsoil from washing away during winter storms and spring thaws. Marling was a special technique used in many cold regions. Farmers dug up chalky clay from deep underground and spread it on their fields. This clay helped balance out sour soil. The practice was so valuable that the right to dig marl was written into many farm agreements. It was backbreaking work that had farmers joking they were feeding rocks to dirt and hoping for bread in return. Sheep and cows became four-legged fertilizer spreaders and clever farm systems. After harvest, farmers let animals graze on leftover plants and fields. The animals got food, and the soil got fresh manure exactly where it was needed. Farmers built movable fences to make sure their animals spread the fertilizer evenly. As one old farming saying went, "A sheep's foot is golden for the field it walks on." Green manuring was practiced when farmers intentionally grew a crop just to plow it under. Plants like mustard would be grown until they flowered, then turned into the soil while still green. As these plants decomposed, they released nutrients and added organic matter to the soil. This technique was especially valuable for remote fields where hauling manure was difficult. Winter soil care also included digging trenches to help water drain away. Too much water sitting in fields would freeze solid, killing plant roots and making the ground impossible to work in early spring. Fields with good drainage could be planted weeks earlier than poorly drained ones, extending the growing season in places where every day counted. Snow actually helped protect soil life. Under that white blanket, tiny helpful creatures could survive to keep soil healthy for spring. Many farmers watched for snow fleas, tiny jumping insects that appeared on sunny winter days, as a sign that their soil was alive and well. When the last frost melted away, these well-cared-for fields were ready for seeds, ending the cycle of winter protection and beginning the hopeful work of spring planting.